If we go back to the sort of 17th century teaching of anatomy in Edinburgh, there were quite a lot of competing anatomy schools. And the university at that time weren't very good at teaching anatomy. So they had Munro Primus, who was absolutely fantastic. His son was equally good, but by the time we got to Munro Tertius, which was, Primus's grandson, he was just reading his grandfather's notes, which included making jokes about things that happened before he was even alive. The students were not inspired. And so because they had to learn anatomy, they were looking at the schools outside. And Robert Knox ran one of these extracurricular schools. And so there was competition between these schools. It was quite a lucrative business back then because students paid to attend and the money went directly to the lecturer. And so Knox could get more people to his lectures, and we're talking sort of 400, 500 people, if he said he could get fresh bodies. Because back then, Edinburgh Council supplied the university with, well, to start with, they supplied them with one body a year for dissection. And when the Murder Act came in 1752, that went up to, they got the bodies of all of the people who were executed for murder. But that still wasn't very many bodies a year. Whereas if Knox said, come to my lectures and I will have fresh bodies, that was quite a crowd puller. And so Knox was prepared to pay quite a lot of money. I mean, it's horrendous that Burke and Hare killed 16 people and supplied him with 17 bodies. But if you do the maths on how many lectures Knox gave, that is less than 10% of the bodies that he used in a year. So you do have to ask yourself where the other 90% came from.
Do we know where the other 90% came from?
They probably came from grave robbing. There's quite a lot of grave robbing teams in Edinburgh that went out as far as Last Wade to dig up recently buried people and sold them to Knox. There was quite a lot of rival gangs.
So how did one get into grave robbing in Edinburgh?
I'm going to say you were probably fairly desperate, and it was easy money. If you ran a boarding house and somebody in your house died and they had no relatives and the body wasn't claimed, there was nothing wrong with you selling it to the anatomists. That was considered normal. Grave robbing wasn't actually a crime. So the worst that was going to happen was it was a misdemeanor, so you might have a fine. But if you were working for someone like Knox, if you were fined, he would probably pay it for you. I guess it was fairly lucrative money. If you weren't caught, you dug up a fairly fresh grave, so it would have been hard work digging it up, but you only dug up a hole at the head end, and then they put ropes down and pulled the body out. And so long as you put back, I mean, if you took the clothes with the body, then you had committed a crime. But as long as you took the clothes, put them back into the grave, covered it up, that body would get you sort of 9 months' salary.
And you mentioned that there were rival gangs of people.
Yeah, rival gangs, which is where we get the difference between grave robbing and body snatching. So grave robbing, you would have actually dug up the body. Body snatching, you would have stole it off the person who had dug it up.
Do you know any of the names of the gangs, or were they just groups of people who came together through circumstance?
There would have been groups of people and returning soldiers from various wars that couldn't find employment elsewhere, but the big one was Andrew Merrilees. He had almost like a consortium of various gangs that went out that answered to him, and he supplied the anatomists through various gangs, supply chains of people who supplied him with bodies.
Was he quite a renowned figure in Edinburgh? I imagine if one body gets you 9 months' salary, then he must have been quite wealthy.
He was, and he didn't hide what he did. They were known as resurrectionists. I mean, people didn't enjoy hanging out with them, as it were, but it was a known thing that this happened. That is why we get sort of big iron cages that go over graves, because you only have to protect the grave for 3 or 4 days and it becomes useless to the anatomists. So you would get people who sat and went into the watchtowers in graveyards, and they watched over graves for the 3 days after their relatives were killed, or after their relatives died. Or we even have death houses in some of the graveyards, which is a big stone house where the coffins were left for 4 days before they were buried.
So which was the more common way of trying to protect the graves? Was it these death houses, watchtowers, or the iron gate?
We've got a mixture in Scotland. The iron gate was the preferred way, sort of an iron cage that goes over it, because you rented it from the graveyard and they put it over the grave for a week and then rented it to the next person. So that was obviously something they encouraged on a commercial front for people to do. But you can see there's devices that used to have shotguns wired up to wires around the grave, so that if the wire was triggered, the shotgun fired at whoever was interfering with the grave. There were some quite inventive ways of protecting graves.